I'm Kevin Landis. I'm the director of the Theater and Dance program at the University of Colorado, and I want to welcome you. Thank you. Welcome you to what I think is just a really special, wonderful talk. Prologue has been in existence now for about 7 years, and one of the things we've been talking about, thank you, one of the things that we've been talking about is, while we love Prologue, it augments both the UCCS Theater Company season, the TheaterWorks season, and is supported by TheaterWorks, Humanities, the Chancellor's Office, the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. Did I miss anyone? I said Humanities, right? And VAPA, well, of course, that's the home department, that's my home department. That there's more that we can do. We have this wonderful, wonderful crowd that always shows up and wants to hear more about the plays. But there's so much that needs to be discussed in American theater, in regional theater, that doesn't necessarily pair with a play. And so we're starting a whole series of initiatives that I'm calling the Theater of Ideas, ways that we can talk about theater. I say I'm calling it that. There's a complete and utter ripoff from my friend Oscar Eustace at the Public Theater, but he said that's fine. We're in which we talk and we engage with theater in different ways. And the first one is this National Town Hall. I call it National Town Hall because what I think is so important is that we have conversations that are local, town halls, that are also engaging with national conversations. And so I've invited today, it seemed very clear to me that one of the great challenges in American theater right now is appropriately representing equality across the board. So we have 2 town halls, one in February that's going to be on race, and then this one today on gender and gender equity. I am a white man, and I am not the person necessarily to lead it, but that's why and I don't need to say this, but that's why I'm going to say very, very little after I introduce our guests, because they have so much to say, and you have so much to say, and what I hope is that it can be a conversation between you, the audience, and the 4 spectacular guests that we have here today. So, you saw on the back of the brochure that I printed up a bunch of stuff that I hope you've had the chance to peruse as we start in on this. The reason this got started was because of a statistic that is now quite common and we hear all the time. 60 to 70% of audiences in the theater are women. Women are buying the tickets, and yet we have a preposterously low number of representation of women in some of on stage and backstage. Why does this exist? That's kind of the conversation we're going to have today. What I'm going to do is introduce our guests. When they're done speaking, we're going to throw it to you and the audience. I think it would be fine if you want to talk anecdotally about experiences here in Colorado Springs, but always with the understanding there's a lot of people who probably want to talk, and to throw it back also to the panel so that we can engage in conversation. Does that sound okay? Great. Our 4 guests who are introduced on your page but I want to just say a couple of things. Teresa Meadows is a wonderful scholar and a friend of mine here at UCCS. She teaches in VAPA, she teaches in Humanities, she teaches in French, she teaches in film. She is an expert on pretty much everything. It's so wonderful to have her on the panel. Of course, Tina Packer, who many of you know, who is here performing in Tempest. I hope some of you are sticking around today for that. She is a preeminent Shakespeare scholar, expert, artist, actress. And she also wrote Women of Will, which is a wonderful book I hope you all have. Carey Perloff has been running one of the great theaters in America for a couple of decades now. American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco has wonderful things to say from her perspective as an artistic director. And Dr. P. Carl, who is the head of HowlAround, one of the great forums, think tanks, if you will, for theater conversation. You should all know that. You should have that bookmark on your computer. There's wonderful things on HowlAround. It is my pleasure to bring to the stage Teresa Meadows, Tina Packer, Carey Perloff, and Dr. Carl. As I said, I'm happy to convene this. I don't want to speak much. We just had lunch and we all talked a lot, and we have an order that we're going to go in. we have an order that we're going to do this in, and I thought we'd each have each of them speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to you. And our order is as follows. We're going to start with Teresa Meadows. Oh, look at this. Teresa Meadows, Tina Packer, Carey, and Carl. So Teresa, may I turn it over to you to start?
I just wanted to sort of start with maybe a journalistic, but for me, a theater set of questions that are the who, what, why, when, where, how, and that cross the range of things that are theater, and that maybe push us to think about engagements and intersections that we sometimes don't think about. So the first one I have is representation, this set of questions in relation to representation. And obviously, we want to look at this in terms of who we're talking about, but also what are we talking about? What kind of representation in the theater? We're talking about physical, numerical, statistical presence. We're also talking about a performative, representational. I come from the French tradition. La représentation, representation, is the word for performance. So this is what it is we do, but also in terms of the metaphoric and mimetic relationship with you, the audience. You know, to what extent we talk about the particular statistic that Kevin referenced, the fact that the majority, the strong majority of theater audiences are female, and that is not at all represented in the whole range of the theater experience. The writers, the directors, the managers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the second area is play and place, what it is we do and where we do it. We talk a lot about, and a lot of these statistics are drawn from the institutions of theater, whether they be nonprofit or Broadway. We've had in the last few years a number of studies that show us a lot of things and that deal with a text-based theater. I would hope that over the next few years, as we're looking at these things, that we would be looking more strongly at both the statistics and the experience of the less text-based theater, the non-institutional-based theater, what's happening out there with the groups of people coming together. I think there's some interesting stuff out there. There certainly is historically. When women don't find a place in the institution, they often make a place somewhere else. And this is one of the things that historical study shows us. The question of question and response. What are the questions we're asking? And what kind of responses do we get? We worry a lot in the theater about whether, and if you've read a lot of the literature, women are accepted as writers, as directors, as this. And this, again, is a historical question. You know, how did Aphra Behn make it in Restoration Theater? How did she actually make a living doing this? Questions that, again, we've been discussing as we're sitting together about being questioned for our topics, for the way we play something, or dismissed or ignored, or becoming invisible. Again, a historic issue. And something that comes up over and over through the centuries, that women writers, many women's roles that are too strong, too unfeminine, too whatever, make audiences, readers, people they're working with, uncomfortable. And now, one of the things that I want to say, and again that I would say history shows us in terms of movement, change, that's a necessary discomfort. One of the writers that I work with regularly always talks about putting the audience at risk. And when I talk to students, they always go, what, like when they throw blood all over you? No. But making us question where we come from, how we think about things, the automatic responses we have and have had, again, for centuries. So last in this sort of set of who, what, where, and where, why, how, is the how. Acts and actions. What do we do? How do we not just lament our sort? And from there, I wanted to go more directly to a historical context. In the history of the women's movement, there has been, it's very often presented as a step approach to change. I would want to argue that it is a multifaceted approach that needs to continue and that should always be there. In the step presentation, the first step was always, where are the women? Who are the women? Finding the foremothers, bringing them to light, finding out about Afrobed and her story, finding out about Rosvita, finding out about the range of women that have been involved not just as writers, but as early actors, as managers, as company owners, as troupe leaders. The troupe that Molière first worked with out in the countryside, I know some of my students from the classical French course will remember, was run by a woman. All of the legalities of how it got to be run by her or something else, but the fact of the matter is she was the driving force. So this remains an important piece. The argument was always, well, the first thing you have to do is answer the question, well, if we don't read them, it's because they aren't there. If we don't play them, it's because they aren't there. Well, the answer first is, yes, they are. But the second one is, there's a recent publication in American theater of the other canon that's again pointing to who some of these women are. Certainly not all of them, but some of them. That's pointing to teaching classes, doing plays, rediscovering a whole set of things that are out there. And it's a conversation that, again, has to keep going. We get better at our research. The databases get better. And we find things. The second step was how we look at the texts that are out there. So even if we accept the canon, what do we do with it? What do we do with the things that have been out there and being done forever and ever and ever? We need to be able to look at it with a critical eye. We need to be able to look at what the women's roles are. We need to, and again, this is a historical step. If you go back and we look at the books that are coming out in the 70s, and this is a lot of the emphasis, reading against the grain. So first we look with a critical eye, then we look with perspective. And I think in terms of what we do, this is another essential step. Again, my students will know that I have a particular bugaboo, which is intent, authorial intent. On the one hand, I really could care less. And on the other hand, it really doesn't matter. There's all kinds of stuff in any piece that the author never intended to be there, that comes from the cultural context, that comes from the historical moment, that comes from the particular perspective in which something is staged. And so if we take a piece, some of which have, over this time period, been staged many, many times, if we take something like Racine's Phèdre, which is the favorite, and which people on this stage have been intimately involved in, or other of Racine's works, where the woman is not only the title of the play, but at the very least of equal import. How do we look at it? We can look at it critically. We can look at it in terms of what it means that this is a female and her role is X. We can also look at it in terms of these incredibly powerful, important roles and what they do say about a woman's place, if you will. I was speaking to a colleague recently about Racine's plays and the women in them. And the first comment was, well, they're all kind of mean. And
I like the men who are so charming.
Right.
Start with Theseus.
But this is where the second comment came in. The second comment was, but they're essentially the same as the men. And I think that that's a really interesting starting point for looking at a classical piece of drama based on all the things we know from history about ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the places that we draw our sources from, the seclusion of women, the powerlessness of women in the polis, et cetera, et cetera. But these are stories that are about powerful people who are often not very nice and who exercise power in particular ways. Berenice is one of my favorites. At the end of Berenice, all of the major characters, male and female, go off to run their separate kingdoms because they are all kings, and that's what they have to do. Right? They don't commit suicide. They don't, they rule because they are rulers, because they are powerful people. So some things about maybe reading against the grain, maybe taking a different perspective. So basically, I guess where I want to go is, again, and then the third step being the push for the now, the new creation, whether it be the writers, the producers, the directors, the push to have that there. And what I want to say in this historical context is, whether it's been stated that way or not, what has happened, but what has to happen in this ongoing conversation, is a continuing intersection between these various efforts. We can't do what we're often accused of wanting to do as women, and that is throw away the canon. The canon is tied intimately to how we got where we are, to who we are, period. And we need to be able to look at that critically. But we also need to investigate the other canon. We can't throw away the old, whether it be in literature or in people. We need to look to that, re-explore it, critically examine it as we incorporate the new. And there needs to be dialogue between those things. We need to not only point to the difference in the kinds of stories that we tell, but investigate how and why. So if male theater, like male history, very often history with a capital H, is great men and events, we need to be able to both uncover great women and events and talk about why the history, small h, and I'll go back to French again, the words for history and story are the same in French. It's just, so the stories that aren't about great men are okay if they're about men, but not about women. So we can talk about Willie Lomax and his everyday and his problems and his children and his, but if we do the same thing with a woman, then it's a woman's play. Right. Then it's, oh, well, do we really care about that? Right. And we need to ask those hard questions, and we need to be able to explore them in this kind of dialogue and on the stage. And with that, I'm going to let our practitioners and some people talk about maybe some more specific things. So.
Thank you. Can I have your thing?
Yes.
Just because mine's behind me. I'm sure you can all hear me without this thing, but I think you're recording it, so I need to do it. I just want to note that, in fact, 90% of our audience here today are women, and I would like to say that I'm sure the men who are here are thinking, sensitive people who really want to talk about this too. But I just think that we shouldn't not note what it is, and we can't do gender fluidity because I can't quite see everybody in any way. You can never quite tell these days. I want to say I spend all my time with the dead white male, William Shakespeare, except he ain't dead, and I would say he ain't particularly white either, but that's a long, hard journey. But because he is an icon of theatre, it does mean within the bounds of Shakespeare we can do all kinds of things with sexism, racism, and everything else, because you always get what was there before and now what we're moving into. into. And for some reason, it always makes sense with him. So I want to say that. I want to note that I began my journey as an actor for 7 years in England, and I had that kind of traditional background at the Royal Shakespeare, at the Royal Academy, all those things. And most of the time I worked with people called Peter and Trevor and occasionally a John. And and I found that we'd have lots of in-depth discussions about what was going on in stage, and always the perspective I wanted to discuss was not the perspective that got discussed. And also we'd have deep intellectual conversations, and then we go back and do it again, and it was exactly the same as it was before, except we'd had a big discussion about it, and nothing really had shifted, and we felt much better, except I didn't. And, and that led me to decide I had to do two things. One was create my own company, and the second was become a director. And that's why I made the shift from directing into, from acting into directing, so I actually could have some power. And I did it in America because the Ford Foundation gave me a grant to actually get to the visceral roots of Elizabethan theatre, and we did it half the year in America and half the year in England. And when it came to set up the company permanently, somebody, a man, offered to help me do it here in America. So that's why I ended up in America, and very grateful I am that I did. The company has always been as much, I founded it with another woman, Kristen Linklater, and the company has always been about empowering women and being a multiracial company. I have to tell you, the drift always goes back to the masculine. It always goes back. So and white, it's a fight to keep it. And when you're working 24/7 to raise the fucking money and to raise the money. I'm very grateful because I'm sure there's a lot of donors in here today, and God bless you. But if you don't have your eyes on the prize all the time, it's a hard row. It goes back to the status quo, because that's the drift of the culture and the society. So it's a constant battle. I stepped aside as artistic director so I could do Women of Will, and I know many of you saw it because I have performed it on this very stage. But what that white dead male says by the end of his writing, and don't forget he was writing for a company of all men, he said, look, guys, if you don't listen to what the women say and go with what the women are going on about, we are all lost. And that's where the late plays end up. And I just want to say it's very invigorating to me to be here, that we're having this conversation, and that if women don't get their voices out there, good night our part, because it's our perceptions, the kind of perceptions you would call feminine, about relationship and feeling and intuition, and really standing fast for other people, and especially people who do not look like yourself. And in the theatre we do that because we walk in each other's shoes all the time. But unless what I would call feminine perceptions are out there, never mind curing theatre, we're not going to cure global warming or our political situation or any of the other things. So for me, one of the functions of theatre is to get women's voices out there. So I'll just kind of conclude by saying this season we did 9 plays. We did 4 by women playwrights. We do Shakespeare and we do modern plays. You know, Shakespeare was a modern playwright in his day, that are language-based. And so 4 were by women, which is not bad. 5 were directed by women, so I think the record is still holding. I did Merchant of Venice, and I did it with 5 different ethnic groups and 4 different nationalities. And I have to say it was the most incredible adventure of going on, talking about this play, which is to do with racism and sexism. And somebody from the audience corrected me, racism and anti-Semitism are not necessarily the same thing. But it was an incredible journey doing it with the actors and actually every day discussing what was going on in the world, because it was the backdrop of a lot of the killings of black men and then the killings of the policemen that we were doing it against, and letting the actors actually in their scenes invest on every level what the racism, the sexism was in those scenes, and let them go out there and explore. And a lot of things came up other than the sexism about Portia not being able to marry who she wants when she can win a whole court case. Ho, ho, hum, hum. And of course, the through line of the play of the anti-Semitism of forcing Shylock to convert, and then his daughter running away with a Christian and being left with what was her life going to be like now she did that. So let me just say, we've done Taming of the Shrew, that particularly horrid play, 5 times, I think, during the 35 years. And every time we've struggled to how to do it. And so the production, I think, that was most successful was when we simply crossed gender cast. So because then we didn't need to make any comment about it all. But we've done it a whole load of other ways, you know, mixing up the sexes and mixing up the races. Another quite successful thing was doing it at Edith Wharton's house. So all the lords became Edith Wharton and all her fellow women writers, and they rescued Kate at the end and ran off with her. So that was not bad as well. But trying to think through how to deal with that play, as a for instance, has been a great challenge. And always, the last one, Daniela Varone, a woman, directed it. She did it fairly traditional, which, you know, was quite pleasing to a lot of people. But then she brought Elizabeth I on at the end, and she harumphed about the role of women in society. And here, probably England's greatest leader, you know, 45 years of peace, not bad going, Elizabeth. So she kind of put a marker on the end. But it does expand your consciousness to do these plays, and I do think Will Shakespeare ended up with us and saying, actually, you've got to get out there and have your voices heard, or otherwise, good night, our parts.
We're going to pass you on the same one. That makes it easier. I don't have to turn on mine. Fabulous. So, you know, there's so many ways that we could frame this conversation that I hope you'll guide us to other things that you're interested in that maybe we don't cover. But I just I'll pick up on a couple of things from Tina and then pass it along. I have an odd background. I started out as an archaeologist, and my introduction to theater was through Greek tragedy when I was very young. And so my fundamental beliefs about the theater are all to do with what it is to do mythic work that unearths primal narratives that have been kind of hidden and puts them forth to an audience in a kind of non-literal way for the furtherance of democracy. You know, I would say that's probably how Greek tragedy functioned, except that women couldn't be in the audience. Okay, we won't go there right now. So, and why was I drawn to Greek tragedy? Because the great roles in Greek tragedy, in my mind, are the women. Now, we know that men played those roles, as is true in Shakespeare. So later in my classical career, I've spent an enormous amount of time in French classical drama because the French hired women and wrote plays for women, and so all the great plays of Corneille and Racine are all centered around women. So I've been thinking about this for a really long time, and I sort of can't believe we're still talking about it. But I also realize that what Tina just said is incredibly powerful, which is the drift to the status quo cannot be overestimated. It is very tiring to push against the tide, right? Really tiring. And theater, you work 18 hours a day just to raise the money, write the press releases, choose the plays, do the plays, produce the plays, find an audience, put it up and move on. That the notion that you're actually at the same time going to reinvent the canon, reinvent who's doing it, and make sure that people in academia know about it is really overwhelming. However, the things you back into your life sort of end up being the things that drive you. So, and what you don't know, I'm saying to those of you who are students in the audience, will save you. I did not know that women didn't lead theaters. And in fact, that has not always been the case. And I think following what Teresa said, we should note in this room, for the record, that the nonprofit theater movement in America was founded by women. Zelda Fitz-Chandler, Hallie Flanagan, Eva Le Gallienne, you name it. Those amazing theaters across the country, the beginning, the genesis of the notion that theater was a community-based 501c3 operation, not for the commercial benefit of its investors, but for the lifelong training of its artists and the inclusion of its audience, was something propounded by women. How we have forgotten this, I do not know, but it's something to constantly remember and revisit, because leadership, whether it's who's the director of the play, the writer of the play, the creator of the narrative, or the head of the theater, is now in this culture very much embodied in the image of the white man. And so we've sort of made this odd detour for lots of reasons which we can't go into here. And there are lots of things that we can actually do about that. When I started in the theater, I started running a theater very young, a theater called the Classic Stage Company in New York, and I learned quickly something I'm sure Teresa May in England is finding out now, which is the men come in and do Brexit and break everything, and then the woman has to come and fix the mess, right? So this is what we women do. Women get handed something when it's a disaster and told, could you now fix it, dear? And then we do. And this is true in government, across the board, if you look at when women actually achieve positions of leadership. But we'll take it where we can get it. And we're really good at cleaning up mess. You know, we're mothers and wives and families, and we know how to do this. I started CSC when I was 27, and it was a total disaster zone where they hadn't paid their payroll taxes in 5 years, and there was no money and no nothing, and so they, for some reason, handed it over to this young woman. And so, of course, when you have a very problematic situation, you learn how to do everything yourself, which is a very good skill set to learn. And I carried that with me when I came to ACT and started running a big LORT theater. I'd never been, LORT is the League of Resident Theaters, if you don't know that, and those are a lot of the major theaters around the country. I didn't really realize at the time that only less than 25% of LORT theaters are run by women artistic directors or women executive directors. Less than 25%. The dial hasn't moved in 25 years. This is bizarre to me because women are really good at these jobs, and these are great jobs for women to aspire to if they actually, God forbid, should want to have a family. So this is something else we never talk about in the American theater. You are allowed to be an artist or you are allowed to have a family, but God forbid you should want to do both things. And so the women that were in New York when I first came to New York and have children all left the field. And this is unacceptable. It's just unacceptable. It makes us a much narrower industry than we should be. It is a humbling and extraordinary thing. If you have ever tried to be a parent, you will never be arrogant again. So it's a great skill set to learn. Anyway, I say this because in both of my leadership journeys, as a woman leader of a theater and as a director, every time I hit a wall, I always thought it was my fault and my failing. It took me years, and you've had Olympia Dukakis here. I don't know how many of you were here when Olympia was here, but Olympia has been my mentor for 30 years in every way. As an actress, I've directed her many times. As a director, she sits on my board at ACT. I would call her weeping after ACT board meetings where they treated me like the little girl who couldn't read the balance sheet. Or they would tell me that my seasons had a feminist agenda, okay? This is if you do Lorraine Hansberry instead of David Mamet. Nobody says when you do a season of Mamet, by the way, that you have a male agenda. Nobody, I've never heard that. So I kept hearing this from my board, et cetera, and I would call Olympia because I don't think theater should be didactic and in your face, but I do think that the multiplicity of narratives that we are missing by not including other voices is a catastrophe for the theater and makes it much less interesting, and that the more kinds of suppressed narratives that are surfaced, the richer the field becomes, and the more we surface narratives in classical drama that are subversive and interesting, the more interesting those approaches become. I would call Olympia, and Olympia would scream into the phone in her Greek way, "Carey, it's the patriarchy!" You know, right? She'd just say to me, "It's 2,500 years of the patriarchy. You think they're going to change it now for you?" You know, right? So, but this is to say that women tend, when we fail, to fail for all women. And we don't think when we succeed, that we even take it upon ourselves. When women interview, they often give credit to all of the people that helped get them to that point and their success. I know this statistically. I've done a lot of searches. Men tend to accept what they've done and take the credit for it. So women in leadership is an uneasy thing. It's uneasy for Kate in The Taming of the Shrew. It's uneasy for Portia. It's uneasy throughout dramatic literature. It's uneasy for the person sitting in the room as the director. It's uneasy for the leader. Leadership doesn't sit in the culture, in our bodies, the way people think leadership should look. So for women leaders, it's really gratifying to know that the times that you feel that are not your own failure and your own inability to transcend it, but actually that drift towards the status quo. And that when you do assert, either as a director, as a writer, whatever, a certain array of concerns, and it is deemed, we won't even go into criticism right now, but watch how women are written about, how female roles are written about, particularly powerful women, particularly women of color. The adjectives ascribed to us are consistently the same, and we are slapped when we misbehave. So about 3 years ago, we started something called the Women's Leadership Project with the Wellesley Centers for Women, which was an attempt to look at why the leadership dial in the Lort Theater hasn't shifted. And I won't really talk about it now except to say it's an amazing study. We did it so that we actually had real data by real sociologists to look at very specific pathways to leadership. And one of the ahas for me, which I would love us to talk further about, and I'd love you all to think about who are going into this field, is the question of trust. Whom do we trust to tell the stories? And why is it that when a story is told in a male voice, we trust the authority of that voice more than we trust a female voice? And that is just something we constantly have to interrogate, because it doesn't have to be that way. It's just how it has been for many, many reasons. And so when we are hiring leadership, I believe in the Rooney Rule. I think, that there shouldn't be a leadership around the country that doesn't say women and people of color should be part of the pool. Then you hire whom you're going to hire. But if they're not even at the table, how is that dial going to move? That isn't a difficult thing to enact. I also believe we should create, as a theater field, a matrix of what we think leadership looks like. What is a good artistic director? What are the competencies that pertain to leadership? And let's share that with our boards of trustees. So instead of them reading New York Times reviews and hiring somebody because they had a commercial success, we hire somebody that might actually have a chance in a community of creating a successful theater. And I'll just close by this because it just happened to me and it was so interesting. I just directed John Gabriel Borkman, a late Ibsen play, at the Stratford Festival in Canada, a festival that is beginning to wrestle with this question. It's always been run by famous men, mostly British men, and that's a whole other conversation. If you think authority, oh my God, Tina, right? If you think authority is vested in white men, try white British men. They're always right. This is what we believe in the American theater. You have a British accent, you must be better. So that is how Stratford ran. So they've only recently hired women. So I directed John Gabriel Borkman. Well, of course, what we found as soon as we got in the room is the play is called John Gabriel Borkman, but it is absolutely a play about two women, the twin sisters. And Stratford has two of the greatest actors in North America, Lucy Peacock and Shauna McKenna. They are Olympian warrior actresses. And they made sure every day at rehearsal that they got in there and claimed their space. It was so incredible to watch that happen. And all the reviews said, how interesting and strange. We thought this was a play about this narcissist, utopian, fanatic, crazy businessman, but it's really about the two women whose lives he destroyed and who are fighting back to reclaim it. Well, that is absolutely in the play. Ibsen, as you know, started with Doll's House, overturning our concept of women in culture, and never stopped. But it was a really amazing thing to go in and just try to re-excavate that play and see what can happen. So I think actually we're at a good tipping point, and I think there are enormously fertile possibilities. But the question is always how to keep our eyes open and our muscles strong, because the pull of the status quo is huge. You're right. Okay.
All right. Thanks. Great. Last but possibly least,
I have to just start with a moment of honesty, because theater is always honest if it's nothing else. I got a number of warning messages from friends that I shouldn't, as a transgender person, come to Colorado Springs, that I would not be safe here. And I just tell you that honestly, because I hadn't really thought about it. Kevin invited me, and I thought, yeah, I'll come. And then I got all these messages saying, "You're not going to Colorado Springs by yourself, are you?" But you seem perfectly lovely, so I don't find you. I don't find you nerve-wracking at all. So I just wanted to say that. So I just wanted to start there. I wonder if I just want you to just take 1 second and think about something you've seen recently. It could be a book you've read, could be a movie, could be a play, but just have it in your mind about what something that you liked, and think for a minute about what you liked about it. Because one of the things I wanted to just talk a little bit about is this idea of story and what attracts us to stories, and as theater makers, why we make them. Like, why do we do it? And one of the things, I think there are a couple of reasons that we gravitate towards stories. At least I know I do, and you probably can relate to this. But you might be thinking of a story that you loved because it reflected something in your own life, right? So sometimes we go to see stories because it's so moving to see ourselves or our experiences represented. And that's one of the things that really draws me to the theater. There's something incredible about just seeing yourself on stage. Like, oh, that's me, that's my story, right? And then the other thing that I think draws us to theater is the idea that we come upon stories that we never imagined, right? And so we never thought of these people before. We never knew what it was like to be a Muslim man as an attorney married to a white Jewish woman in a play like Disgraced, for example, or it's something that we couldn't relate to, but then we learned something. So we come to have our imaginations expanded in a way. And, one of the things that happened for me in this work when as we talk about gender diversity, I ran a place called the Playwright Center in Minneapolis for many years, and our work was to develop new pieces for the stage. And I didn't know that it was going to happen to me, but after a number of years as the artistic director there, I started to get quite angry about a number of stories that were out there. So if you think about how many stories are out there, and then you think about how many stories it would be possible for the theater to tell, and then you actually look at how many stories the theater really tells, I was really blown away. Like, there are this many stories, and there are this many stories the theater could tell, and the theater was telling this many stories. And I was like, and so I had all these plays, I had all these incredible stories. No surprise, they were often by women and people of color and trans people and people that who were having a slightly different view of the world. And I would send them around in my job as artistic director to other artistic directors for them to consider for their season. And I have one in particular that made me the most angry. One response that I got, I sent out this play by a woman who had written about Fallujah, about the Iraq War. It was this beautiful little piece. It was a simple and very touching and poetic play. And I sent it off to a male artistic director, and he said, you ought to spend more time developing your plays before you send them around, just sort of rejected it out of hand, even though I had done it for many audiences, and it was completely lovely. And he talked about it, it's being a little slight. And I thought, oh my God, how many times are women's plays called slight or feminine or too soft or too this or that? And this was a play about the Iraq War, so of course, how could a woman be writing about the Iraq War? And so I spent a lot of time at the Playwright Center advocating for stories that were a little bit off the beaten path. I love things that I don't already know about. That's why I like learning. And I love plays that are a little bit quirky. And I love plays that are sometimes a little poetic. And I wrote an article one time about I like plays that burn my house down, that just shock me. And I worked on a play that went around the theater for a long time called Detroit, where an actual house burns down. And I don't know if you've actually ever tried to burn a house down. It was down here. Oh, it was great. Oh, great. So yeah, that was. So yeah, that's like that's a play that I brought to Steppenwolf Theater when I was there, and Lisa D'Amour is a playwright that I've worked with for many, many years, and her voice, we couldn't get her voice out there for anything, and when she wrote Detroit, I was like, by God, we're going to get this play out in the world. And so Steppenwolf, we produced it at Steppenwolf when I was working there, and honestly, it really is hard to burn a house down on stage. I don't know how you guys did it here. We didn't do it that well at Steppenwolf, I'll just say. It kind of fizzled a little, but it was a cool idea. I love that play. But Lisa's voice was another voice, another woman's voice, strange and unreal stories that are actually real. If you ever spend any time with Lisa, you know that she's lived those stories, almost every word of them. And so I think about that, and I think about what draws us to stories, and then I spend a lot of time just myself thinking about beauty. And one of the things that there's a great book, I teach this book all the time, it's called On Beauty and Being Just by Elaine Scarry, and she says, and I think about this in relationship to the stories that we allow to be told, she says there are two mistakes we make in beauty. The first mistake is that we overcredit something, and so we think something is super beautiful and we give it too much credit for being beautiful, and we discover is actually not that great. And I think if you've been on any dating app, you probably know what it is to overcredit beauty, right? So, he or she is so hot, and then actually you meet them and it's not that great. And so overcrediting beauty is something that we do. But the other thing we do is we undercredit beauty, right? So something that we think, oh, that's not actually, I think that's ugly, or I'm not interested in that, or that's not a story I want to hear. And then we actually experience it, and it changes us in a way that we didn't expect. And so Elaine Scarry talks about her undercrediting beauty was the palm tree. She always thought palm trees were ugly, and then one time she encountered one, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever encountered, and she had an epiphany about palm trees. And so I'm really interested in the ways we undercredit beauty. I'm really interested in the way that we undercredit stories that we don't already know, and how we imagine things to be beautiful that we couldn't have imagined to be beautiful. And so one of the things that I got to do this past year, I just want to share in the world of representation of on the stage around gender diversity, a little slightly different. I spent a lot of time thinking about trans stories and how we talk about gender fluidity, because actually if there's any place in the world that should be gender fluid, the theater should be one of those places, right? And so this past spring, or actually winter, I guess, because it was cold in New York, I worked on a show at the Public Theater called Southern Comfort, and Southern Comfort was it's actually a documentary that was done in the 90s, a very unusual, before its time documentary. It was done about a group of transgender people living in Toccoa, Georgia, of all places, and had created this community supporting one another. And it's not a pretty story. It's not beautiful in the way that we think about beauty. They had lived very simple lives. The narrative, the average income of a transgender person in the U.S. is $10,000 a year, so they probably fit into that category. They had very simple existence, and they had created community with each other, and they cared for one of their transgender friends who was dying of cancer through the course of the documentary. It's a beautiful, wonderful documentary, and again, done before its time. And so a musical was made of it, and I was asked to come in and work on that musical. And so I did. It was very controversial in its casting, and also in its who represents who. Can non-trans people play transgender characters? We're having a lot of conversations about that in the theater. Who can play what part? Can men play women? Can women play men? Shakespeare has allowed us to do that, but in contemporary theater, these are very complicated questions around race and gender diversity. We had a big town hall about that question, and lots of different viewpoints about who can play who. But I can tell you the thing that I knew about it going into it, and the reason that I worked on the piece, one was because they had a creative team that had no transgender voices in it, and so it was really key for me to, from my vantage point, to make sure that somebody was there just thinking about what it would be like to talk about real people. Sometimes we sentimentalize what we don't know, and I didn't want the creative team to sentimentalize what they didn't know. And so I spent a bunch of time working on that play, and as you do with theater, it was a moving and beautiful experience, and it had such a profound impact on audiences because it was a story they'd never seen before, and it was a story about people they'd never imagined before. And the most moving part of it for me, which I'll just end here, I wanted to share with you, I have a brother who lives in New York, and I said, oh yeah, I don't talk about my work very much with my family, and I was like, I've got this play running at the Public in New York, and you should go see it. And so he, unbeknownst to me, went to see it, and I was sitting at home one night late and got a text, and he said, Carl, I just want to say to you, I went to see that show, and I got to be honest with you, I just haven't spent that much time thinking about, people who are living in trans lives in Georgia, and I hadn't, it's something I just hadn't come across. And I'm sitting in this Uber on the way home, and I just can't stop crying. They were such beautiful people in that show, and it makes me just be able to see you and understand you in a way that I hadn't imagined before. And I think that's what we do theater for. It's why we talk about diversity of all kinds in the theater, is so that we can understand the incredible diversity and complexity of the human experience. And that's really why, for me, uncovering stories that we might not have imagined to be beautiful is probably our most important work. So.
So, I do want to open this up to the audience. I want to just add one thing. In coming up with these town hall conversations, and this was in large part due to seeing the Southern Comfort Town Hall in New York and how moving that was for many people. That we're having this conversation about gender, we're having a conversation about race in February. And it did strike me, and this is on me, that the entire panel in front of you is white. And that it is interesting to say, and I think this is where theater companies often have trouble, that we're gonna tackle this problem today. We're gonna do this play next year. And we're gonna, and as if that's okay, and all of these conversations have to be intersecting and interacting. I should add to that, my friend Kate Berry and Lynn Hastings have been integral in helping me think about these things and bring this to Colorado Springs. The last couple of days, I've been chatting a lot with Lynn, who we all know Lynn Hastings, fabulous actress who can actually speak to this from multiple viewpoints, from being a woman, but also being a woman of color. And she had said that she'd like to say a few things. Is this a good time, Lynn? Should I bring a mic to? Well, we have a mic here, and we have all the extra mics. We don't need all of these. Could you pass this back to Lynn? And this mic can go around. We have a mic here, and then we can all share two mics, right? Yeah. And I hope if you have some comments, and I hope you all do have comments, because that's what this is about, that you'll grab one of these two mics. But I'm going to leave it to Lynn for a few minutes to chat from her perspective. Thanks. Would you press the on? I think the on button is probably.
Is this better?
There you go.
There we
Great.
go.
Thanks.
Probably like Tina, I don't need the microphone very much either. First off, I want to say thank you all, because you all mentioned not just about gender, but all of you mentioned multiracial, of color, and it's a conversation that goes hand in hand. And, the experience for me is different because I am a woman of color. And Carl mentioned, it's slight, it's feminine, but when it's women of color, it's too powerful. It's in your face. It's angry. I don't understand why black women are so angry. So in my experience, when there's a play done for women of color, that's how it comes off. For colored girls who've considered suicide, it's uncomfortable. The experience for a woman of color is uncomfortable. If I do vagina monologues, and there's one that says, my vagina's angry. It's different when it comes from me than if it comes from, like, Sarah, because there's a perception with women of color. And so I think that some theaters tend to shy away from it because it makes the audiences uncomfortable. And usually, in my experience in doing plays about women of color, most of the audiences, who are mostly white, will come up and go, that was wonderful. I had never thought about the black woman's experience this way. Thank you for sharing it with me. And I think that we have to represent more in our companies. You do what you know, and if your company is made up of women and men and people of color and of different gender identities, you start to do different kinds of theater. You really do. And I think from women, 70% of the women, your nice statistic, I read the same thing as we were talking, represent our audiences. We should be sharing these women's stories. We should be sharing that with the women in the audiences. And men, my husband, sitting here, benefit from it as well. They don't see it as slight. My husband doesn't see a piece about women as slight. He sees it as a story that needs to be told. Every experience should be shared in the theater. That's our job. That's our role in society, is to share experiences and share stories, everyone's stories. That's what we do as artists. So thank you for taking the time to come here today.
I love this because... is this on? Yeah, now it's on. I just want to say, the genesis of the Women's Leadership Project was that Theater Communications Group, which is the big national service thing, finally said we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion, and we're going to start with race. Then we'll get to gender. It's the same conversation in the most profound ways, and it makes no sense to separate out the conversations. And as we did the Women's Leadership Study, it all became about race and gender because it was all about pathways. So why are there obstacles in the pathway to expression, right? That's the real question. Not that there are multiplicity of voices ready to express, but what are the obstacles in that pathway, and how do we clear those obstacles, and who gets to make the decisions? That's why I care about leadership, only because it's not always true, but when more kinds of people are in leadership, presumably more kinds of stories get to be told. But what you just said is the ubiquitous thing I hear over and over again in our field, and you divide it out and you say we're going to solve this little piece of the problem, then we'll solve this little piece of the problem. And so we're also not a very unified field in thinking about how to unearth these questions, which is really a shame because many of the strategies are absolutely comparable, really comparable. And sadly, women are always told to stand at the end of the line. And that means women of color are really at the end of the line, And so that I think is a really important point.
So I just want to add to that in fact all not-for-profits are run by boards of trustees. And I think the relationship between boards of trustees and an artistic organization are fundamentally flawed for a whole series of reasons which maybe we can't get into here. But the truth is that what the Board of Trustees has is the fiduciary responsibility, and therefore our boards of trustees tend to be wealthy, and when push comes to shove, they're expected to put up the money. And it just feels to me that I'm just going to say from my point of view, and I love my board of trustees, but by God, the things they argue about are not the things I argue about. But in the end, when push comes to shove, then we go what they say, not what I say. Because the money is where it comes down in the end. So I want to just say that.
Yes, could you, Lynn, would you pass that back there? Thank you. And
Testing. Testing. Okay. All right. So, people who put on top quality theater productions have a big job. They must entertain massive amounts of people at very high stakes. Success is critical for profits of future shows. So my question is, do you think that the directors of these performances hire the background crew based on their personal gender and racial stereotypes? Or do you think that the directors hire the best person for the job?
I think the question is falsely posed.
So what's the answer?
And it's a really good question. There's so many ways to define who is best. So if best is the person who's done it most before, it will always look like the same person. That's just the reality. We have to know that, right? So when you're looking to hire a director, let us say, I'll give you an example of a big musical. Men, usually gay white men in this country direct musicals. There are very few women, you could count on one hand the women you've heard of who direct musicals. So if you want to say who is the best, does that always default to the category who's done it the most? I would say not necessarily, and there are many other skills that attach to that. when you hire somebody, I've just hired a woman to direct a musical. So what did I think about? I absolutely thought about her talent, what I've seen her do. I think she's a proven talent. She hasn't done what I've just hired her to do. So what's my job as a producer? To make sure she's successful. So one thing I would say is, it is naive to believe that men succeed on their own merit. People who are given the chance to do things succeed because there is an envelope around them that helps them succeed. If we want women and people of color and trans people and people who don't look like the club to be successful, it is our collective job to make sure they're successful. So if a board of directors hires Carl to run a theater, and Carl looks different from the last guy to run the theater, the board has to make the commitment to collaborate with Carl and the community to make that hire successful. It doesn't just happen. Nothing just happens. There is no best. It's like IQ tests. Do you know how much IQ tests vary according, I just have to say this, according to what you've eaten for breakfast? Do you know this? And according to temperature. So they have now just talked about, let's talk about global warming, that people in hot climates with no air conditioning cannot take those tests. Let's think about that. So I think the best continuum is really fluid, and what's most important to think about is, what are the competencies for this job, right? And then how do I hire it, and how do I communicate to my audience why I thought that was the right hire for that job? And that's our jobs, to communicate.
Just before that goes on, I want to add another point to that, the way that question was phrased. It is also a question that is exclusive to a particular kind of theater, and that you ended with for profit. And I think that asks for a very different answer than the broad discussion that we're having here. If the end question is profit, that's very different, the end question being quality theater. So.
I really appreciate, just want to make sure this is back on. I really appreciate the conversation around intersectionality and the fact that we have to resist the status quo. One of the things that we keep saying is that 70% of the audience is women, 70% of the audience is white women, and the conversation about the audience itself and articulating the intersectionality of that, because just in our own reality, what is and is not even brought to Colorado Springs is based on the reality of the audience, particularly here at Theater Works, where I was in a conversation that a play was not brought here because of the audience and who the audience is. And the relationship between the audience, the relationship between the board of directors, and then even ourselves resisting, constantly always fighting to resist the status quo. In the last hour or so, we've heard Greece and Britain, I don't know how many times, and represented as the classic and the space from which theater emerges. And for me, that's total BS, right? And if we keep doing that, then we will keep reproducing, even in ourselves, when we try to protest and protest too much, we'll still be doing whiteness, right? And doing over and over and over the same kind of exclusionary practices that happen and rob us of being able to see ourselves in representations, right? To be able to see our stories in ways that are not shocking or not exceptional or not thought, they just are, right? And until we get to the point that it's not extra and with the and or the plus or I not thought about life that way. You should be thinking about life that way. Like, you should be waking up every morning thinking, like, if I go to the grocery store, will I be killed? Because that's how people are walking around in this place, because that's the reality of life for the United States right now. So I really appreciate and want us, not just from the director and actor perspective, but sitting in the chairs where we are, to be thinking about how we are limiting the kind of stories that are told.
I think what you're saying is just fantastic. I want to... Yes, sorry, so little time. I just think we don't want to lose a single member of our audience that is coming now, and we all can do with bigger audiences. And for me, that means, how do we get other people whose stories need to be told in the theater? so that in fact the audience is as racially mixed as the people up here on stage. And this seems to me an enormously important thing, and I think it does have to do to some degree with marketing as well.
But I also just say, in Colorado Springs, you're not going to get a racially diverse audience. It is a predominantly white space. So white people have to watch other people's stories. Like, for example, you asked about the last movie we saw or play that resonated with us. Southside with Me played in one theater in in Colorado Springs, because Colorado Springs is a very white space. And so if white people only want to see what is resonating with them, then we're always going to be back to, well, I just got to keep who is coming satisfied.
I just want to, I mean, you're saying everything that matters in this conversation. I just want to add, I mean, I think, you know, the theater was very much built in frames of whiteness and exclusivity, and I think and I think that's it's part of our legacy. And I think as we sit here, I mean, one of the responsibilities we have is to be you know, is actually to be actively working against that. And as audience, I mean, I think what your point about Colorado Springs, you know, Boston has a different scenario, but in Boston there's a terrible the terrible racial divide in that city, unlike any city that I've lived in of its size. It's been the worst I've seen in the absolute inability for particularly Black and white people to speak to each other. And in those frames of whiteness, it is a responsibility of the white people in this community to clamor for the things that are not familiar to them. And so it's part of, you know, it's part of the work that we have to do as theater leaders. And it's not, you know, it shouldn't be your singular work to do. It has to be the work of all of us to make that movie run more than 2 days in one theater, right? But that has to be, and I think, you know, back to the money conversation, the question we have to ask ourselves always when we're making theater is, are we making profit or are we making civilization, and a civilization in which we can all live with some sense of, some ounce of security. And I think those are questions that get all mixed up in the theater. And so one of the reasons that we program a lot of white theater in white spaces is because we're selling tickets to white people. So I think that's it's a problem, and it's not a problem that's going to go away anytime soon.
Okay. Just really quickly, I'm just thinking about so much that's being said, and I think about, you know, we've focused on the lack of representation in the theater of the artists, and a little bit of talk about who's writing the plays. And I know in my own personal experience, there's policing that goes on within minority groups, you know, about politically, you know, what will sell to an audience, you know, or whose story. You know, for example, I've been told that no one has any interest in a story about a person of color who isn't poor or who isn't struggling, that it has to be a prescriptive story. So the policing around this goes everywhere, you know, and the reality is that, you know, the funding of productions and things like that is just a bottom line. But then I think about, well, who is on the board? But I want to say something, I guess, kind of hopeful, is that after years of teaching literature and being a writer myself, is that when you bring a story that people can somehow find a way to empathetically connect to, I give actually more credit to the participants in the audience, and I think that we need this sorely. When you think about what's happening in the world, is that the more that we know about each other's stories, and I see this in the classroom, you know, writers humanize the human experience, and of course that experience, you know, like a prism, you know, reflects people's contexts and histories and experiences and things like that, that it actually becomes a way to connect us. And I,
you know, I would love to see, I understand the realities, you know, the economic realities of theater companies, but if we think about like our own theater company here, of taking what might be perceived as a risk to regularly offer up, not just even canonical writers of color, because in fact that's what we tend to see, as Hansberry was mentioned and writers like that, but taking that opportunity and maybe giving the audience the benefit of the doubt, like Kevin has done today, to allow us to have these kinds of conversations in that context. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I just feel like it's something I needed to share.
Gosh, after listening to your question, I think I got my question muddled. But it had something to do with, you know, kind of the gauntlet that people are throwing down to the communities to be responsive to these questions of race and gender. And I was thinking about what you said about Southside. Stayed a lot longer in Denver, didn't it? I was thinking about what you said about your friends warning you a little bit about coming to Colorado Springs. And, you know, we have a further blockade in Colorado Springs attitudinally, and deservedly so, hopefully getting better. I don't know. I haven't lived here consistently over a period of time to see if there's any changes. But the gauntlet is bigger in Colorado Springs than it is, well, in Denver, in London, other places, because we truly are such a
But I'll just say, you know, it's on us who run theaters. There is no prescription, and we love to say, oh, I would do that, but my audience, you know. And I don't believe it. I mean, I've gotten in terrible trouble at ACT. Often I got picketed by the Catholic Church. I've got, you know, so I know what it is to really piss your audience off. But I also think this is what I really believe about being an artistic director. I think it's not about moving a show to New York. It's not about, you know, it is about an investment in an aesthetic, in a community over a long period of time. And if you're willing to do that and have a dialogue with an audience over a long period of time, it is amazing the kind of work you can do that you would never think would be possible, you know, but it's on the leadership, which goes back to the question of who are the leaders. You have to choose people who have that commitment, whose goal is that. And there are many ways to do that prism. My city is 42% Asian. That's the city I live in. So was that what I knew when I came to San Francisco? Not really. So my deep dive over 20 years is to really learn the many facets of Asian and Asian American theater happening there and how to represent it. And that meant hiring a bunch of people at ACT from those cultures who could tell me much more than I already knew. Different ages of people, different backgrounds of people, and so the work starts to change. And if people see that over a long period of time, this is a place where a lot of Asian American art is happening, those audiences follow. It doesn't happen quickly. Trust is very hard. Takes a long time to feel that you are welcome in a place. And so that's a long endeavor. That's what makes it interesting, but it's why the leadership question is huge.
Question? A question and a comment. Culturally, the word acceptance is used often with looking at diverse populations and people that are quote-unquote different. I think that as a population, we need to look at that being patronizing and being passive, so that we look at other adjectives that we use when we are trying to promote ourselves in a variety of ways.
Thanks. So a couple of things. First of all of this experience that you guys have, right? Amazing, strong women, so impressive. So I have a couple things about that. First of all, in this day and age, that this is still a conversation is really disgusting, right? I mean, seriously. Second of all, I'm wondering about, I'm of an age that I grew up in the 60s, a lot of things going on, feminism, right, was rising. Are there young women who are as strong as y'all who are coming up to pick up the gauntlet? Because what I see are women of experience, women who have been doing this feel very strongly, but I don't know anything really about the younger generation.
Well, I'm hoping all of my women students from the department will raise their hand.
They're all here, yeah.
Woohoo!
More than we should.
Kind of to go off of that, I wanted to kind of, yes, there are young women in theater who are very enthusiastic about this. We currently have a student who's directing a show, and not only when she cast it, she cast some characters, she cross-gendered them, and I asked her why, and she said, you auditioned the best. And I think that's great that we've got young women. It's really encouraging to see my fellow students as excited about this as I am, as excited about as these women and as you all. We want to be here in these conversations. We want to talk with you guys. We want to talk with you guys. We're very excited about it. We just keep searching for these opportunities, and we're very thankful to Kevin, who has put all this together for us. So.
As I go over there, I'll also say there are places you can look. If you, Carl's HowlRound has amazing mix of authors, many people writing constantly, and then there's things like Kilroy's, if you guys haven't heard of it, which is a list every year of great female playwrights, and every year they come out with another list of great plays to look at. You can go and find them and tell Murray to produce them.
So I'm an actress in the Springs, and I'm a woman, a person of color, and a lesbian. So if we're talking back the line, we're way at the back of the line. I was at an audition once where the men hadn't shown up yet, and the person who was casting it knows me personally and asked me to read the male roles until the men showed up, which I was happy to do, but I was pissed off that I wasn't considered for the male role. I could read for it to help the other women get cast, but I couldn't be considered for the male role. So I'm wondering how we start having these conversations where instead of a student who just cross-genders the cast because they were the best people who auditioned, how do we have the conversation with our big theaters that says, you know, you're always looking for men. Stop looking for the men and look at the women who showed up. How do we have those conversations so that it's not always about, ooh, I'm taking a risk by cross-gendering this play?
I actually think that is happening all over now. I mean, certainly in the last couple of years, across the country, there are at many different kinds of theaters, work being built around really exciting women, or what we used to call non-traditionally cast roles. The irony is, I mean, another reason I've tended, I never wanted to be an artistic director. I did it so I could actually do the plays I wanted to do, and I didn't have to ever direct Sylvia. That was like, right? So I have my list of like the plays I refuse to ever do, and you can only do that if you're an artistic director. So, but I will say, that women, for in the industry at large, for every 12 roles for a man, there are 5 to 7 roles for women. So if you want great actors, you are more likely to find women who are willing to do those roles. You're just more likely to find them statistically. Again, whatever that means about best, if you look at numbers, right, and you think you're invisible, try being middle-aged or older. So middle-aged and older women are truly invisible. So if you want to get great actors, do Clytemnestra 100 times. You're going to get, right? I saw that gorgeous poster of you in Happy Days, right? Fantastic. Those are, worth looking at. I mean, if you want great actors, look for roles for older women. Look for writers, male, female, trans, otherwise, who write about middle-aged and older women. Those can be cast much more easily, because that population is hungry to work. But I do think the explosion of that in the last couple of years around the country is incredible. It doesn't mean everywhere, but if you look, I think you're going to start seeing that, and it's sort of heartening.
My question was, how do we have the conversation? Since it's been done and you guys are doing it, how does this community start that conversation? That's a good question.
I'm supposed to answer that. Wait, we're having this talk. Well, no, and I don't know the answer. And as an artistic leader and as a white man, and if you look at the artistic leaders in this town, many, not all, of course, but many are white men. there is a discomfort with wanting it to know if this is the conversation that I'm supposed to lead. So my hope is to have more conversations like this and say, okay, yeah, I'll organize because I'm in a position of leadership, but I'm probably not the one. Well, no, that's not true either, because I was thinking, Carey and I were talking about this too. I was chatting with Olympia a few months ago about this, and we were talking about the Women Playwright series that we did, sub-series of Prologue. And she sort of needled me, and I don't remember exactly how she put it. She said, but you're putting these very successful women on stage and then saying, how do you fix the problem? Go. And that's a problem too. So can you help me out? I mean, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yeah, they have thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay, oh, there we go. So I think actually a big part of getting different people cast is honestly taking a group of like-minded people and going out and doing it. Because I know that predominantly in at least my major, a lot of us want to be actors and actresses, but there's a couple of us, including myself, who want to be like stage managers and directors. So if you find basically like-minded people and you create it, if you can't find it, like already in the community, you have to create it on your own. And if you want it to be more successful, yeah, you probably should interact with the other people who are already well established. But this is theater, so they probably will actually go along with it. So
I just want to add to that too. I think it's a youth movement from my experience. I teach at Emerson College, and I work with a lot of young people there. And they're not that interested in those two gender categories. Like two doesn't seem like quite enough, and they're very suspicious and don't use them very often. And so I was saying to these guys, there's actually 58 gender categories on Facebook that you can now choose from. And so, I mean, I think this is a really interesting, and I think young people are actually going to change that. I think my experience of being a transgender person, I might be a year or two over 40, is that people, anybody over 40, certainly over 50, or they're like, what? More than two gender? Really? But when I'm hanging out with my students who are 18, 19, 20, 21, they totally get it, and I feel like you should be talking to people who are less invested in those two boxes, because those two boxes have kind of crushed this profession and crushed a lot of actors out of this profession. So,
yeah. Never mind.
No. I love the idea of going out and creating it, but we don't want to have to go out and create it. As an artist, I don't want you to have to go out and create your own theater so that you can do the work that you want to do. We have an obligation as theater community to be inclusive, okay? I don't want you to have to go out and create your own theater because you can't get on a stage here. To me, that's a disservice as a foremother. That's your option. That shouldn't be your only option. That really shouldn't. I appreciate you doing it, but don't do it because you can't do it anywhere else.
I just, from a stage management standpoint, Chris will beat me up if she doesn't.
Kevin, can I make
and
one
then Teresa can finish us off, because we do have to get off the stage for a show that happens in 20 minutes.
Okay. I'm not being Pollyanna, but I'm tired of Colorado Springs being bashed. I lived in Colorado Springs at different times in my life. I kept going back to New York City because you all are the type of people who I found in New York City. The reality is in Colorado Springs, we have Jim Jackson is up here from Millville Theater. They do women playwright series every season. They've done, I don't know how many, 6 or 10 women playwright, and they give the women the opportunity. We have Sarah there from the Springs Ensemble Theater. She did cross-generation, her theater and the people that work with her did cross-gender casting. So, yes, right. Oh, thank you. So it's happening here. It's beginning. Kevin does this and more, and his students are amazing. I've been to a lot of their productions, and they do shows that mainstream wouldn't think of doing. And if you go to them, you're exposed, you learn, you get excited. I think we are compassionate people here, and we do connect in a way. And if you watch Netflix, people tell me about some of the shows. I said, oh, I can't watch that. I'm hooked now because they do edgy things. Mm-hmm. And I think it's happening here, slowly, but we're beginning. And I think we have to take credit and spread the word,
because I think a lot of us don't know that some of these other theaters are doing things as well. We get sort of insulated because we love theater work, so it's easy to stay here. But there are other groups that are doing cutting-edge things. So, okay,
yeah,
I'm done.
No, it's important to say. I'm going to let the final word be from Teresa, and then we'll wrap up.
I just want it really quickly, and it ties very closely into what was just said and earlier comments. I completely agree with the idea that it is our responsibility as institutions, as educators, as to keep this question at play. I think that in response to some of the comments earlier, the biggest danger is well, that's just the way it is. That's our culture, that's our town, that's our whatever. But I also want to say to the young people starting their own things or saying, well, you know what, this isn't happening, let's do it. That's what has to happen too. It has to be, it's not an either or. It's got to be all of the above. And we've got to just keep at it.
In conclusion, I just want to say in 20 minutes, Tina is going to take the stage in the reading of Tempest.
Instead of Olympia Dukakis, who we have invoked all over the place.
I'm sure her ears are burning. And a lot of the theater faculty and students will be involved in that as well. Julie, do we need to clear the theater? If you're staying and you know your seat, great. If you're not, thank you so much. We could have gone another couple of hours. I know that Teresa and Carey and Carl are seeing this show, so perhaps more conversation can happen in the lobby, but we need to give the theater. Thank you so much to all four of you.